Can people at home hear me okay? Can you write in the chat if you can hear okay? Anybody? Interesting. Does it still echo now? Okay. We'll just give it a couple more minutes to let people filter into the Zoom. Yeah. So it's still very echoey. How does this sound to people at home? Okay. I think we'll give it a try with it as it is, and if it's really bad, let me know and we'll see what we can arrange. Okay, I think we should make a start. So it's my pleasure to introduce James Webb, who's working with Ted Sahoglu, and he's going to be telling us about his current PhD work, all the stuff he's been doing in the last few months. So over to you. You might need to.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. Hopefully you can see the slides. If my voice sounds a little bit echoey, feel free to just butt in and say. But yeah, hopefully you can hear it okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Much appreciated. I'm here to talk about some research me and my supervisor, Ed Sahoglu, have been doing, which looks at what underpins the learning of degraded speech. So first of all, what do we mean by degraded speech? Well, it's any speech where part of the original signal is missing or has deteriorated in some way. So to give you an example, see if you can make this out. I don't know if anyone could kind of make that out, and hopefully those viewing from Zoom can hear that as well. You might have had some difficulty hearing that. I'm going to just play it again. It's an example of noise vocoded speech. So speech that has been artificially degraded. Now that probably sounded really quite difficult. I don't know if anyone could make that out at all, that little sentence, no. It is, yeah, quite tricky, but the really amazing thing about this is that after a few tries with a particular type of degraded speech, people can really quite rapidly improve. So this graph here is taken from a paper published 16 years ago by Matt Davis. And what we've got on the x-axis is the sentence number. So participants were given 30 sentences, one after another, and their accuracy scores were looked at. So their accuracy in transcribing the sentences, we've got on the y-axis as percentages. And you see, at the beginning, they do incredibly badly. But then, very, very quickly, using the same degradation type, the sentences get much, much easier to recognize by listeners. And like I say, that's just one sentence after another, and with no feedback whatsoever. So it's really just given a sentence, transcribe the sentence, no feedback, very quickly people get better. And this ability that we have to rapidly tune in to degraded speech is something that we have to, by nature, get quite good at in everyday life. So whether it's a case of talking with a bad phone signal, or, for example, you're in a noisy environment and you're trying to tune in to a particular sort of speech, or maybe you're talking to someone with an accent that's quite different to what you're used to, and you quite quickly you're tuning in to how they're saying the words, and quite quickly you're able to adapt to that. In a more medical context, you have people with cochlear implants. So this girl here, she's got a cochlear implant. We can see this microphone here. It's a microphone and a digital processor. Essentially what it does is it takes the signal, it digitizes it, it passes it to the cochlear implant and the artificial cochlea inside the head, and this supplies the auditory nerve with electrical pulses which approximate something like what normal speech would sound like, but it's really quite degraded. So compared to a natural cochlea, whereby the speech signal is as you normally experience it, this is a really degraded speech signal, and yet people with cochlear implants who otherwise would be deaf or close to deaf, they can very quickly learn to adapt to this degraded type of speech and learn to hear to a really good level. So our question really is, how does the speech perceptual system tune into degraded speech? How is it that we do this kind of amazing ability that we need for everyday life? So there's a few different ways we could approach this question. So I've got three possible ways up here. So the first way is we could ask, well, what are the neuromechanisms involved in tuning the perceptual system to degraded speech? So we know obviously that we can tune into degraded speech. What might it involve? Might involve some sort of recalibration of perceptual space, some ability to upweight cues that are preserved, downweight cues that are degraded. Or maybe the second way we could look at it, we could say, is this learning dependent on high-level information, i.e. lexical information? So we know that at least there's a good amount of research to suggest that we're constantly making predictions about what sort of word is going to come next when we're listening to speech. Maybe these predictions help to modulate early sensory processing to help us tune in to degraded speech. Or the third way we could look at this is we could ask, at what unit or level of perceptual representation do these learning mechanisms act on? So we know that there's going to be a level of perceptual representations that we need to manipulate, so to speak, in order to learn. What is the level at which that's happening? And it is this third question that we have focused on, and that my talk today is going to be on. So, possible levels. So again, we're on this question, at what unit level of perceptual representation does speech learning mechanisms act on? So starting at the kind of highest level, the kind of in order of magnitude really, perhaps it's occurring at the lexical level. So lexical level just means word level. So Garnham is a lexical unit, it's a word. So perhaps it's happening at the lexical level. But it seems that this probably isn't the case, because what we find, and this goes back to that same piece of research that graph earlier is from, Davis 2005, he found that if you train someone on a certain number of words using a particular degradation filter, people get better not at just recognizing those words, but at recognizing other words. So it seems to learning can generalize, and because it can generalize, we know that learning does not occur at that level. If learning was occurring at that level, what we probably find is that you would just get better at the words that you're trained on, but that isn't the case. There is generalization. So perhaps then it's happening at, I say perhaps, it must be happening at a level below the word level, at a pre-lexical level. So the possible candidates might be that's happening at the syllable level. Again, we're going in order of magnitude. So syllable level, gardener, or perhaps it's happening at the phoneme level. So here we've got it that the phonemes are equivalent to the letters, which isn't really the case because there are more phonemes than there are letters, but this is a kind of rough approximation. Or perhaps it's happening at the allophone level, which you might not have seen before. The allophone level is really just the variant or a phoneme variant. So there's different ways to say a particular phoneme. Perhaps, to give you an example, so in gardener, you've got the d in gardener. It sounds different to the d if it's at the beginning of the word, like dream or do. So you would say that these are allophonic variants of the same phoneme. So perhaps it's happening at that level, or perhaps it's happening at an even smaller level, at the phonetic feature level. So essentially all phonemes, allophones, are made up of phonetic features, i.e. the ingredients, the things that we're doing with our mouths that make up a particular allophone or phoneme. Perhaps it's happening at that level of phonetic features. But me and Ed, we've taken the approach that actually maybe this isn't the right way to think about it. Maybe thinking in terms of syllables, phonemes, allophones, phonetic features, perhaps that isn't the right way to go. And the reason why is because we're not quite convinced that this is the level at which people are learning about. We're not quite sure that although these sorts of candidates, they're really good at describing language. If you're a linguist, they're great ways to describe language, but there's no convincing argument to really say it must be at this level that people are learning when it comes to speech, i.e. it's convenient for linguists talking about language, but is it really a good way to think about it when it comes to how speakers learn to listen into a particular type of degraded speech? And these thoughts aren't completely original. So there's Samuel in a 2020 paper who wrote, psycholinguists do not assume that linguistic units, i.e. syllable, phoneme, allophone, phonetic features, have a privileged status in perceptual processing. I mean, why would they? They're very good for describing language, but in terms of describing how we might process speech, there's nothing prima facie that would say these are appropriate. So we've taken this approach, which is essentially to say, instead of thinking in terms of linguistic units, let's not think about it like that, and let's think about it in terms of learning occurring somewhere at the acoustic level. So it's still maintaining this idea that learning is sublexical, it's not at the word level, it's below that. But let's not think conceptually, let's not think in terms of linguistic units. Let's think about what level, what type of acoustic representations are being used in degraded speech. And our hypothesis, our sort of answer here, is that it's happening at the level of spectral temporal modulations. So spectral temporal modulations is a kind of conjunction of two things, spectral modulations and temporal modulations. So temporal modulations are fluctuations in intensity over time, and spectral modulations are fluctuations over frequency. So this here, this is you've probably seen this before, it's a spectrogram, and so nothing too original here. So spectrogram, this is a sentence, the radio was playing too loudly. And what you see is on the x-axis we've got time, so it's about 2 seconds. And then on the y-axis we've got frequency, so the higher up on the y-axis, the higher the frequency. And you see here the different colors, the intensity of the of the various frequencies are represented by the color. So if we took, for example, this here, see this kind of ray of light here, this is the t, this is a consonant t in too loudly. And we can see it's a really, really quick one. So it happens in time very quick. So we would say that has a fast temporal modulation. Fluctuation intensity over time is very quick. At the same time, we can describe it in terms of spectral modulations. We can see that it's really spread out. So the frequencies are kind of all over the place. So we'd say that it has quite a coarse spectral modulations. And we can image this using this graph. Now, this is a graph that is designed to capture spectral temporal modulations. And we can see here that the t, which is very quick, comes down quite high on the x-axis. So I should probably describe this a little bit. So the main thing to understand about this graph is that unlike the top one, which has on the axis time, this whole graph is for the entirety of the sentence. So it's energy at the various spectral modulations and the temporal modulations for the entirety of the sentence. So we can see here with the T, it comes down with quite fast temporal modulation. And it's very low on the y-axis because it's got this really coarse spectral modulation. So it goes really, really low down here. Whereas a vowel, so the radio, the O in radio, that's got a longer temporal modulation, so that's nearer 0, but it's got this really, you see all the ripples here, this sort of zebra pattern. That's essentially a fine spectral modulation. You get these fine patterns, which you normally get with vowels, so that goes quite high on the y-axis. So in summary, this way of thinking about sound in terms of temporal modulations and spectral modulations, that they're really, these features are a really good way to talk about what constituents go into a particular sound. And the reason why we think they're really relevant is that when it comes to MEG and fMRI research that's been done, it seems as though the brain is tuned towards spectrotemporal modulation. So it would seem to be the case that neuroresponses are modeled as responses to spectrotemporal modulations. So that's the kind of theoretical basis as to why we're focusing on this particular level, and is why the hypothesis for the study is that perceptual learning occurs at the level of spectrotemporal modulations. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the stimuli that we generated. To give you a little bit of background, because I realize I talk about the design after this. The design of the experiment is essentially, we want to see how people trained on one type of modulation filter get on with the other type of modulation filter. So we want to see how people improve on the one that they've been trained on, and how much they improve or don't improve on the one they haven't been trained on. So essentially what we wanted to do is create these two modulation filters. And actually maybe I should get this down so you can see. So this is on the top here, the top two graphs, spectrogram domain, the one that you just saw at the top of the previous slide, and modulation domain is a graph with spectrotemporal modulations. This is without any sort of filtering at all, so we've got this nice pyramid shape. So if I play the sentence.
Glue the sheet to the dark blue background.
Okay, no degradation at all. Essentially what we want to do is we want to create two filters where there's no overlap between them. So this is one of the filters, and what you'll see is that we let through all this sound here, but on the other one, it's only the sound outside that block, so there's no overlap whatsoever. I realize I should have probably just explained that you might have got confused that you've got a positive on the x-axis and the negative. That don't worry about that, it's not really too important for these purposes. So with the low-pass temporal modulations, what you're essentially doing is you're saying we allow the temporal modulations up to 4.875 Hertz through, but you don't allow temporal modulations after that, and you end up with sentences that sound like this.
Glue the sheet to the dark blue background.
So what it's essentially doing is blurring along the temporal axis, so it's blurring across time. And so certain sounds, like the t sound, consonant, oh sorry. Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
I think it would be on that screen there. That touch screen. Start speaking. Yeah. Oh, no, it's not. No one else has it. Southern British thing must be.
Yeah, so hopefully I can only get it a bit louder, but hopefully it does make a difference.
Do it on Windows as well.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Right, so yeah, on the sound that you just heard, you have blurring along the temporal axis, and so that essentially makes consonants very hard to hear, like a t sound. But vowels, they'll still be quite easy to hear. Whereas when it comes to high-pass temporal modulations, we're only allowing the faster temporal modulations through. So things like vowels become harder, but consonants will be a lot a lot easier to hear. So when I play this sound, which is a high pass temporal modulations, maybe listen out for the things like the consonants, like the t, and d, those sort of sounds. Okay. Okay, cool.
Did you play the low pass as well?
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah, so low pass is sort of, you'll find vowels a bit easier, but the consonants a bit harder.
Blue sheet to dark blue background.
And the high pass again, consonants will be easier, vowels will be harder. And the reason why we chose these is essentially, it wasn't an arbitrary choice. It was, we wanted an equal balance between how hard participants would find it. So before any training, participants will get about 30 to 40% correct on the low pass and the high pass filter.
Glue the sheet to the dark blue background.
Okay, you'll hear them all again now.
Blue sheet to dark blue background.
Okay, so the study design, the way I've put together this slide is I've coloured in blue all those where it's low pass filtered sentences, so low pass temporal modulation filtered sentences. Red is the high pass, and the green for, I haven't got to this yet, this is the visual filtered sentences, which are, just to explain. So in short, everyone has the same pre-training and the post-training, and these are essentially the things that we check. These are what we perform a statistical analysis on, because we want to see how people change from there to there. All that it differs in all the participants is that if you're a low pass training group, you have just low pass filter sentences for the training. So to take this group, for example, you have a headphone test. Everyone has a headphone test, and that's essentially just to make sure people are wearing headphones and that they're at a good level of loudness. And then everyone gets a demo, which is just people getting familiar with the stimuli. And then there's a pre-training test, and that's an equal number of sentences that are being filtered with low pass and sentences that are high pass filtered. And then in training, well, for the low pass training group, it's just low pass filtered sentences. And then again, post-training test, you have a mix of low pass and high pass filtered sentences. Similar for the high pass, just that the training obviously differs. And then we've got a visual training group. And in training for that group, what we have is that the participants have visually distorted sentences. And the reason we do this is really just as a control group to control for retest effects. And like it says at the bottom, we aren't repeating any sentences. We want to make sure that we're measuring perceptual learning and not memory. This was a test. This is an experiment that we did online. So we used Gorilla as a mode to run the experiment. And then Prolific was how we recruited participants. It was about 45 minutes on average per participant, all the way from the headphone test to finishing the actual experiment. One thing to just remark on is trial procedure was a little bit different. The testing was different to the training, that is. So in testing, it was just a case that you would play the degraded sentence, people would type what they heard afterwards, and they hit return. Whereas when it came to the training, what happens is that you play the degraded sentence, you type what you heard, but then afterwards you get this feedback. So the feedback consists of playing the sentence again, but this time the clear version, the undistorted version, and you get it on the screen as well. You get it written on the screen. And then after that, immediately after, they get played again, the degraded sentence. And the reason we did that is because it's been shown as a really effective way to boost the training, to make the training super effective. And the visual training groups, this is an example of what you get in the training block if you were doing the visual training, if you're allocated to that group. I don't know if anyone can make that out. I think that screen probably makes it a bit harder. So anyway, you'll get this screen to show you what it is. after you've typed your response, that is, and then you get the degraded. And again, we're doing that just as a way to boost the effectiveness of training. And then in terms of measuring the accuracy, we aren't measuring the accuracy of every word, we're measuring the accuracy of the 5 keywords. So in this sentence, for example, we've got the sentence, mend the coat before you go out, and this participant has responded, mend and craft before you go out. So we've got an algorithm to correct for typos, so essentially it goes, mend, got that correct, coat, not correct, before, correct, go, correct, out, correct. So you go 4 out of 5 keywords correct. And our hypothesis is essentially, well, that perceptual learning occurs at the level of spectral temporal modulations. And so if that is the case, then what we'd expect is that learners should be really highly specific to the degraded speech heard during training. So if, for example, you're trained on low pass filtered speech, then you should just get better at low pass filtered sentences and not high pass, and the vice versa for high pass training. And this should be revealed by a significant 3-way interaction. So that's between the training group, whether you're in the visual group or the low pass filter group or the high pass training group, and between block type, that's pre and post training, and the filter type, whether you're measuring accuracy on the low pass or the high pass speech. And so the results. So I'll go through the results one by one per training group. So first training group is the low pass training group. And what we see here, so we've got on the x-axis the block, so pre-training on the left and post-training on the right. And then on the y-axis, we've got the accuracy scores. And what we see is pre-training, people are doing about 30% accuracy. But after they've been trained on low pass temporal filtered speech, they're going up to about 60%. When it comes to the high pass speech, there's not really much improvement at all. Then with the high pass temporal filtered speech training group, so on the low pass speech, the one they haven't been trained on, there's no improvement, pre and post training. But again, with the one that they've been trained on, there's an improvement, and it's very similar to what we see on the low pass, from about 30% to 60%. And then with the visual training group, we don't really see any improvement. As by way of doing a statistical test on this, we've used a mixed effects logistic regression model. So to do that, we split up all the sentences into the individual keywords that the participant responded with. So for example, the example you just saw, it would be mend, do they get correct or not? So mend, correct, coat, not correct, before, correct, go, correct, out, correct. So each one has a binary outcome. And then in the model, we specified all the fixed effects, the main effects and interactions effects. And because we wanted to take into account variability in participant and sentences, we used random intercepts and slopes. And then essentially what we do is we run a model, a full model that has the 3-way interaction effect. And we compare that full model with the 3-way interaction effect with a model that has everything except that 3-way interaction using a likelihood ratio test. And that does indicate, as you might expect to see from the graphs, that there is that including a 3-way interaction effect provides a better fit for the data than a model without it. And just revisiting the graphs, just to kind of emphasize one particular point, is the specificity of the learning. So what studies have found in the past where they've looked at various levels at what the locus of learning might be when it comes to the perceptual representation of speech, they've generally found that, well, they've all found that there's some sort of generalization from what people have been trained on to untrained, to what they haven't been trained on. But here, with spectral temporal modulations, we find a great degree of specificity. So with the low pass temporal filter training group, yes, we know that they get a lot better on the low pass filter, but they don't get really any better on the high pass filter, not significantly so. And the same for those trained on the high pass filter group. There's no improvement pre and post. So what has been seen in the past is, for example, if you were to train on different frequencies, just to give one example of some previous research, you find that there is generalization from the frequencies that someone's been trained on to the frequencies they haven't been trained on. And there's nothing like this that we see here. So by way of recap, then we've used spectral-temporal modulation filters that ensured there was no temporal modulation overlap, and we found that it's really very, very highly specific to the spectral-temporal modulations that are trained on. And this hasn't been seen before. So, like I say, where you look at acoustic frequency, or you look at people being trained on one type of voice and test on another type of voice, there's always some degree of generalization, but we don't really see that. So it does indicate then that learning does occur at the level of spectral-temporal modulations. But we do want to do one further step of verification. So we do want to seek some further verification, because what we've done so far with the filters is we've made sure there's no overlap whatsoever on the spectral-temporal modulations that are preserved. We think it's worth asking the questions, well, what happens if you have a little bit of overlap? Because if there is a little bit of overlap between what's preserved on two modulation filters, then you would expect there to be some improvement on hearing sentences. That would seem like the logical sort of thing to suppose. So what we're just starting to do now at the moment is we're using two different types of modulation filters where there is overlap. So this one we've heard before, the low pass temporal modulations, is just the same as what we've seen previously.
Blue sheet to dark blue background.
But what we want to do in the other type of filter is, instead of blurring it over the x-axis over time, what we're going to do is blur it over the spectral modulations, so over the y-axis. So you can see here how it's blurred up vertically. But what you'll see from these graphs, which are the graphs of the modulation domain, is that there's overlap. So at this level, we can see there is some degree of overlap. Now, just bearing in mind the sentence that you just heard, low pass temporal modulations, and just think when I play the next one, how similar it might sound to you. So I'm going to play the low pass spectral modulations, a sentence produced by a low pass spectral modulation filter at 0.27, and just think, how similar is this? So to my mind, it sounds, I'd be very happy to hear comments on this actually, but to my mind it sounds very dissimilar. But our idea is that despite this kind of superficial acoustic dissimilarity between the two, there is actually a huge amount of underlying acoustic similarity at the level of spectral temporal modulations. So even though it might appear that these are very dissimilar, in theory there should be learning that we expect to see. We expect to see that cues that are preserved in the top one will also be preserved, at least some of them will be preserved in the bottom one. And so people that are trained on the top one should in theory get a bit better. We don't know how much, we haven't made kind of an estimate of that, but we do expect people to have a degree of improvement on the bottom one. So that's our next steps really. So thank you for listening in to this, much appreciated. And thanks to my supervisor, Ed, and also Milan for giving us some much appreciated statistics help. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. That was really good, really interesting. So I haven't got a very good question, but it's about the last study. I don't know if you can bring up the last slide that had up there. So it was kind of when you were presenting that and looking at the areas of overlap, I was sort of thinking, well, the bits that are overlapping are presumably the bits that we already know how to do, and since that's the normal bit, and what you're learning is how to make do with not having all of the stuff that's sort of blued out. But so you're rather than sort of learning to use that, you're learning when you can only have that, and whether that then has implications for how you think it might work with the overlap. I mean, I don't know, the previous results, they're so nice, they're so beautiful about not having any transfer at all. But it was only when you put up this that I kind of thought, actually, maybe what you're learning is something slightly different from what I thought it was. But, you know, what do you think people are, going back to your first setup about how you might learn to do this, what are people doing when you've stripped out so much information from the signal that what you've got is what you normally have, but without the whole load of extra stuff?
Okay, yeah, so sorry, are we thinking about this, the kind of new stimuli, or are we kind of generally
No,
I
think maybe I'm thinking if you were to relate this right back to your questions at the start about what exactly you're learning. Okay, yeah. What can you conclude so far?
All right, I think yeah. So I think it almost goes back to that. So you know, when I had the slides about, you know, what things can we look at, what particular ways can we use to look at answering this question, and the first way is we look at what the neuromechanisms involved, rather than what is the perceptual representation that's involved in it. So I think, you know, what's happening is that when you have a modulation filter or any sort of filter, acoustic filter, what your brain's doing is it's latching on to the cues that are preserved, and there are many cues that are preserved when others are degraded. So whenever you are trying to disambiguate a certain vowel or consonant, there's various ways to do that. So people have counted, I think, 16 different ways that people can distinguish a B from a P sound. So some of those ways will be more preserved with one type of filter, and other ways will be preserved with another type of filter. And so, you know, what probably is going on when it comes to these sorts of filters being used is that people are doing some sort of remapping or weighting certain cues and downweighting others, and that's probably what is happening, what people are looking onto. So in this one, for example, we've got low-pass temporal modulations, and people want to tell the difference between a T and a B. Certain cues will be a bit difficult to attend to, but other ones might be a bit easier to attend to. So yeah, I think it's kind of like that's what's happening, and people have given different names to this process. Some people call it reweighting. Other people have talked about it in terms of remapping. That there's an argument to say, I think, that they're essentially the same thing, but maybe they kind of capture different aspects of each. But yeah, I think that's it. Just training the brain to focus in on what is preserved and downgrading what isn't preserved.
And if people are weighting certain aspects, do you find that when you play just completely normal sentences, people perceive those to be slightly weird because they've got so used to upweighting certain signals that when it's normal, they can't actually tell whether it's a normal stimulus?
Yeah. We haven't looked at that, but yeah, so I think it's a good point. I mean, there are studies that have looked at kind of manipulating how people put the boundary points between. So if you've got a B and a P, you can manipulate that, and then you can go back and see how people do, and there's a change. So yeah, it definitely influences how people listen to normal speech. Yeah.
So with this type of degraded speech, nothing springs to mind personally, but I can think of time compressed speech. If you listen to time compressed speech, very fast speech, and if you then hear normal speech, it's like really, really slow. That's like after effects. But yeah, I'm not sure about this type of speech, but yes, it's possible.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat. So Jamie asks, says it's a really clear talk. Are they given any feedback during the training phase? So is it supervised or unsupervised learning? Okay, yeah. So being online is really just a case of us looking afterwards and seeing what's happening. But yeah, when they are, so it's not supervised in the sense that we aren't watching them. I know there are some studies that they actually make people have a video camera in front of them so they can see if they're actually attending to what they're doing, but that wasn't what we're doing.
That wasn't what I meant, actually. Oops, sorry. What I meant was, are they given feedback so they know when they're getting the answers right or wrong, or do they have their own internal model of when they're getting it right or wrong?
Oh yeah, let's go back to a few slides. Yeah. Maybe I went over too quickly. So in training, after people have typed in the speech that they heard, or at least what they thought they heard, they're given feedback. Now, this feedback doesn't say, oh, you got 4 out of 5 words correct, but I think implicitly they'll know how well they did, because they'll be able to see clearly what the actual sentence was. So we don't have a mechanism whereby in the course for it we say, oh, your accuracy on that sentence was 80%. It's just a case of after people typed in their response, the feedback should be enough that they know how well they did on that sentence.
I suppose then an interesting question is whether or not that is really important, or whether they can just by virtue of practicing figure it out. But I don't know. I mean, it's another query is how is it that they're learning, is that feedback the key difference? But anyway.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there have been studies that look specifically at this question about how people do when they have this type of feedback and when they don't have this type of feedback. And this type of feedback is really important. People will learn without it, but they won't learn quite as well.
Sam.
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk. So to follow up on this idea of like attention reweighting, I really like the idea. I guess is the hypothesis then that because this learning happens fairly rapidly, doesn't it? And it's all in one session.
Yeah, that's right.
So would you maybe expect that after like a very long training period, then you would start to see changes in the lexical and sublexical representations of words, and they would maybe just shift more slowly. And I guess related to that, is it the case that you think that these attentional shifts are relatively short-lived? So do you know how persistent they are across time? Like to come back after a week of having not had any practice.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not too sure, to be honest. Yeah, there isn't something we've looked at. I think it's a really good question. And I think it's a worthwhile question as well, how long they persist for. I think there have been studies that have looked at this, and there is persistence, but I just can't quite remember how long it's been, whether it's a question of days or weeks. But there does seem to be some degree of persistence. I'm just not too sure of the time frame, and of course those studies aren't exactly the same as what we've done. It seems there is some degree of persistence, but how long? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Yeah.
I may follow up with another question. So I wondered what, maybe this is a little cheeky, but like going back to the very first experiment you showed where selective effect in only the filters that were trained. Do you think if you had 200 participants, you wouldn't see any evidence for an increase in or any generalization? Or do you think it's just that there is an effect, but it's just very, very, very subtle? Because it kind of did look numerically like there was.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, when it came to one of the groups, the low pass group, that is, yeah, I think this is the one that you might be thinking about, where there's a little bit of an increase. Yeah, I mean, our hypothesis, I suppose, would be that, yeah, this, I mean, there could be, I mean, if you compare it to the control group, for example, there's a little bit of an increase there on that one. Not on that one. I mean, our hypothesis would be that there shouldn't be any increase. So if you did a lot of participants, like 200 in each group, yeah, we'd hope to see that no higher than for the visual training group. I guess it would be reasonable to suppose that there might be a bit of an increase, just because, just by way of having repetition, having, you know, you've heard you said a certain type of distortion pre-training, and you get that again post-training. So you've had a bit more familiarity with it, and we know that familiarity makes it a bit easier. So I think it'd be reasonable to expect that, yeah, it would be reasonable to expect that, yeah, you might get a bit better. Yeah, I think, but hopefully if we did for 200 participants each, then, you know, you should also see that effect in the visual training group. And there is a little bit of that here. For some reason, it's not on this one.
So I think that's why the control group is so key. So it's not, the critical test is not whether there's a difference between pre and post in training. It's about whether there's the difference is over and beyond the control group. And I think next step, James, maybe would be to do a Bayesian test.
Yeah.
To see what's the evidence for the absence of generalization.
Yeah.
You have the data to do that. It's designed or allow you to do that.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
So we've got a question from Zoltan. He said, could you characterize specificity in terms of the psycholinguistic features as well? So if you were to train on the degraded vowels, would you only improve on vowels and vice versa on consonants?
Yeah, okay, yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, so if training was just vowels, so I suppose the design of the experiment would be quite different from this one in the sense that it'd be very difficult to use words. If you're just training on vowels, you'd have to like forget about words because words tend to have consonants in them, and so it'd be a case of having maybe the stimuli being like an R or an E or an I.
Just try to degrade just the vowels or just the consonants within a sentence.
Oh, I see. All right, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking maybe that's what you had done. In other words, that's one way of looking at what you've done. One could view it within a sort of, the psycholinguistic framework. One of your manipulations degraded vowels, the other degraded consonants. At least that's how you characterized it. So maybe one can see that as the reason underlying specificity.
Okay, and were you thinking about that in a particular sentence, you just degrade one, or so?
Well, I was thinking, isn't that what you've already done?
So it's making me think whether, well, we've degraded the whole sentence, whereas I think maybe you might be thinking that within the sentence we just degrade the components that are vowels or the components that are consonants.
Yes, I mean, I was thinking that you've degraded the whole sentence, but by doing so, you've done it in a way that targets the vowels or targets the consonants.
Yeah.
So one can still think of your results in terms of the sort of psycholinguistic units that you sort of put aside at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So to make the focus on one or the other. I'm just trying to think.
It might just be different levels of description. So I mean, they're not necessarily contradictory hypotheses.
Yeah. Okay.
So Charlotte says, beautiful results graphs. There were some individual participant differences, e.g. in the high pass group, some improved a lot from 10 to 60%, others less. Do you think there are any factors that influence how much benefit individuals get from the training? Primary auditory cortex structure, musical training, etc.
Yeah, I definitely think that. I mean, there's a huge, like you identify, there's a huge amount of variability in subjects, and I find it quite amazing. Some people will be very good. I mean, you don't see it so much in these results because they are, because the way that these graphs are done, they're done by whether they're tested on low pass or high pass. But if you were to look at, say, spectral degradation and temporally degraded sentences, you see a huge amount of variation there. Some people are very good at listening to sentences where there's spectral degradation, but not so good at temporal degradation, and vice versa. And yeah, like you highlight there's variability even within just looking at temporal modulation filtering within low pass and high pass. I think, if I had to guess what this might indicate, just as a wild guess, I think when it comes to people listening to speech, I think there is variety in how people attend to different sort of cues, and so that might be what we're seeing here. There's many cues that we can focus in on when we're listening to speech, and I think that it's reasonable to suppose that there's variability in people as to what particular methods people use to hear speech, and that might underlie the variability that we see. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, or whether I kind of captured the wrong part of that.
I think it does, but I think it's something that you could, something that would be interesting if you could find, individual mechanisms that people would be interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Stuart asks, how does assimilation affect your sounds? I don't understand what it means. I'll help you do it.
Simulation. I don't know. Do you?
how does the degradation?
Assimilation, I think.
Assimilation. I don't know if Stuart, do you want to clarify?
Hi. What I mean by that is when in language you have a phoneme before and phoneme after the sound, and we perceive something different, you know, like unvoicing, voicing, that sort of thing. So I thought you seem to be looking at the perception of the sounds as you hear them, but what's the higher level of effect? Does that make sense or not? So for instance, I'll give you an example. A used car, and used to, people automatically do that, and they would differentiate because you've assimilated the sound to the following sound.
Yeah, I think I see. So that effect. In what particular way were you thinking about it in the context of the experiment? Sorry if I'm being a bit. I'm not.
Well, you're looking at representation, and you're breaking down some of the information content, and I'm saying, isn't this a bit higher order? Sorry, I can't explain myself, and obviously I'm not the specialist as some people in the audience, but it seems to me that I just wanted to know how you sort of took in consideration that you're not really just listening to a word, you're processing it in a high level. And these sounds before or after might affect the sounds that the people perceive. So if you're taking some of the information out, for instance, if you took out, I don't know, low frequencies, which would be, say, voicing, you might actually, people might not hear that.
Can you look at this by making the sentences more or less predictable? So if you have a set of very predictable sentences that are like, you know, standard and regular versus very irregular sentences, and you look at the differences between those and that would actually address this kind of question.
I think I see. Yeah, how because like you say, the sentences that we use are predictable in the sense, and we do. I think it's fair to say the responses that we have to sentences sometimes exhibit, especially when you look at where people have got sentences wrong. You see there is a sort of logic to the sentence, and so people are using I believe higher level techniques to kind of get at what the sound, what they're hearing. So in that way, there's I think it is fair to say that there's a kind of a kind of low level sensory input. So certain people are trying to use the cues of the speech signal that are still existing, and they're also probably using higher level input to kind of come together to make sense of the sentence and to produce a coherent sentence, because they know that the sentences are coherent sentences. So yeah, I think there is that process going on. And so yeah, to control for it, then yeah, one method might be to take out the higher order level and to say, well, let's maybe have random words in. But then I suppose the problem in doing that is that, you know, I think maybe our guiding principle here was we're really interested in naturalistic speech processing, and in naturalistic speech processing, there are going to be we're kind of prediction machines that are constantly making predictions about what word is coming next, and that does, it seems to be the case, that it does modify lower level sensory representations. So we don't want to we'd rather, I think, not exclude that. I don't know if you disagree with that, Ed.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. I think I'm not still entirely 100% about the question, but I think it was another way to interpret the question was about whether, you know, how does the general context with which you produce speech, so phonemes are going to be expressed differently depending on the surrounding phonemes, and so how does that relate to what we're investigating? That's how I think I interpreted it eventually. And I think that another way, you know, that example you gave, the used to, the acoustics are different, and so there is research that suggests that there isn't so much generalization between those two, you know, expressions of the vowel. But then we would say that's because of there's differences in spectral and temporal modulations. And, so it's it's consistent with this idea that we're trying to push, and it's also backed up by what what the brain seems to be doing if you record responses from auditory cortex in animals as well as humans. It seems really, really well tuned to the spectral and temporal modulations. So that's the idea that we're pushing. I'm not sure if that's what's a question is, but.
Okay, I think so. We've got one more very brief question from Samira. She asks, were your participants all English as their first language?
Oh yeah, that. So in prolific is really good because you can specify whether it's English people speak as a first language, and you can even specify which country they're from. So yeah, these are all British speakers of English as a first language.
Cool. And I think we should stop there. But thank you for a fascinating talk and a fascinating discussion afterwards. Thank you very much. And next week we have Zoltan will be giving us a talk about phenomenology. So, thank you very much. Also, I have baked a weird cake. If anyone wants a weird cake, please come. And if people on Zoom can also have weird cake if they want to come to my office.
Define weird. It's legal.
It's legally weird. It's a chocolate potato cake.
Oh wow.
And it's a recipe from 1912 from the Great Depression. It is weird. But it's,
are you practicing for something that you fear might be coming? Touch wood. Touch wood.
Yeah. We've got to get used to living minimally.
True.
Excellent presentation. Got lots of questions.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, really interesting questions. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thanks for chipping in with stuff.
Oh yeah, no, it's.
I honestly think the thing that made it
It's hard not to. I was trying to let you understand, and you were doing excellently. But so there's always so much to say.
I'm gonna